34 years, 90 plus peer-reviewed papers. One conclusion that most of the climate conversation doesn't want to hear. A researcher affiliated with Harvard and the Smithsonian says the sun, not carbon dioxide, is the dominant force behind Earth's climate. And according to his data, the sun provides 99.99% of the energy that drives our weather and climate systems in the first place. So, why isn't this the headline everywhere? Why does almost nobody talk about this? That's exactly what we're going to look at today. Not opinions, not talking points, but his actual research, the studies behind it, and just as importantly, what his critics say is wrong with it. By the end of this video, you'll have enough information to form your own honest opinion. Let's start with who this scientist actually is. His name is Willie Soon, an astrophysicist and geoscientist who has spent decades in the Solar and Stellar Physics Division at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He holds a PhD in aeronautical engineering from the University of Southern California, and since 1992, he's also worked as an astronomer at the historic Mount Wilson Observatory in California, one of the most important solar observation sites in the world. Over his career, he's published more than 90 papers in journals like the astrophysical journal Nature Geoscience and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2018, he co-founded an independent research group called Ceres Science, focused specifically on solar terrestrial physics, the study of how the sun affects Earth. Before we get into the science, it's worth understanding how he's viewed within the scientific community, because that context matters for everything that follows. Not everyone agrees with him. We'll get to that in detail later. But he does have defenders with serious credentials. Theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson once wrote publicly that he respects Willie Soon as a good scientist and a courageous citizen. So here's the real question. What did his research actually find that's generated this much attention? Both support and criticism? Let's look at his central claim first, in his own words. In a December 2025 interview with the German outlet Weltwoche, Soon laid out his central argument directly. He said the sun is the overwhelmingly dominant force driving Earth's climate, not human-emitted CO2. His reasoning starts with simple physical fact. The sun provides 99.99% of the energy that powers our weather and climate. That number itself isn't controversial. It's basic solar physics. What's controversial is what he says comes next. That satellite data shows solar radiation isn't constant. It fluctuates, particularly in the ultraviolet and X-ray ranges. And according to Soon, those fluctuations correlate with temperature patterns over the last 150 years far more closely than CO2 levels do. His argument, in his own words, you can't make laws against the sun. That's a memorable line, but here's the first piece of real evidence he points to. And this isn't even his strongest evidence. Before I tell you what his next piece of evidence is, take a guess. Over the last 400 years, do you think there's a documented period where low solar activity lined up with a period of unusually cold temperatures on Earth? If you guessed, yes, you're right. And it's one of the most cited pieces of evidence in this entire debate. It's called the Maunder Minimum, a period between 1645 and 1715 when sunspot activity dropped to historically low levels. This same window overlaps almost exactly with what historians call the Little Ice Age, a stretch of unusually cold winters across Europe and North America, frozen rivers, and shortened growing seasons. Soon points to this as strong supporting evidence. When the sun's activity drops, Earth's climate visibly responds. It's one of the clearest natural experiments in climate history. No models required, just historical temperature records lined up against sunspot counts. This is where scientists started paying much closer attention to his work, because the Maunder Minimum correlation is genuinely accepted as real by most climate scientists. The disagreement isn't about whether this happened. It's about how much weight solar variability should carry compared to other factors going forward. And that disagreement gets a lot more complicated once we look at his next claim. This next part is where his research actually caused a dispute. Not just disagreement, a real scientific pushback. Soon has argued that widely cited temperature graphs, including ones distributed by NASA, are skewed by something called the urban heat island effect. Cities and towns run hotter than surrounding rural areas because of asphalt, concrete, and air conditioning units pumping out heat. If most weather stations used to build a global temperature record are in or near urban areas. Soon argues the resulting graph will show more warming than what's actually happening in the broader environment. His claim: when you instead use rural station temperature data, the sharp warming trend often shown in mainstream graphs looks much less dramatic and lines up more closely with solar activity than with rising CO2 levels. He's gone further, pointing to reporting that a widely used NASA solar activity graph wasn't based on direct satellite measurements at all, but on what one paper in the journal Remote Sensing described as a model reconstruction rather than raw data. This is a finding that generated the most formal criticism of his work, and we'll cover exactly why in a few minutes. But first, let's look at what he's working on right now, because this isn't old research. It's active, ongoing, and recent. In February 2026, Soon co-authored a new paper in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Space Physics, introducing a new method to forecast dangerous solar superflares, massive bursts of X-ray radiation from the sun that can disrupt satellites, power grids, and communications on Earth. This is a live area of research, not something settled decades ago. Before that, in 2024, he and several co-authors published an updated dataset in the Astrophysical Journal, compiling satellite measurements of total solar irradiance, essentially how much energy the sun is putting out, spanning 1978 to 2023. That's 45 years of satellite data, freely available for anyone to review. And in January 2026, he released a 12-minute documentary-style video in collaboration with a production group called Guerrilla Science, opening with a line that sums up his entire position. Anyone who says the climate science is completely settled, he says, isn't being honest about how complex the system actually is. So this raises a real question worth asking. If this research keeps getting published in peer-reviewed, established scientific journals, why does this overall conclusion remain so controversial? Soon has an explanation for that too. Here's something most videos on this topic don't mention. Soon has described what he calls an iron triangle, a cycle where political funding shapes what research gets prioritized. Scientists deliver findings that match those priorities, and media coverage and amplifies the result into public consensus. In his view, this creates pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, that marginalizes researchers whose data points in a different direction. It's a serious accusation. And whether you find it convincing or not, it's important to understand it's not a fringe idea he invented alone. Versions of this argument appear across the wider debate about how funding shapes scientific priorities in many fields, not just climate science. But here's where things get genuinely complicated, because the same question about funding influence gets pointed right back at him. Before we look at what his critics say, take a guess. What do you think is the single most common criticism raised against Willie Soon's research? If your guess involved money, funding sources, you'd be right. It's the most frequently raised objection, and it's backed by publicly documented records. Let's look at exactly what those records show, without spin in either direction. According to documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and reported by Greenpeace, Soon received over $1 million in funding from petroleum and coal industry sources between 2001 and roughly 2010. That included $335,000 from ExxonMobil, $274,000 from the American Petroleum Institute, and 2 grants totaling $175,000 from the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation. In 2015, Southern Company, one of the largest coal-burning utilities in the country, ended its funding agreement tied to his research at the Smithsonian. That same year, after a paper he co-authored was published in the journal Science Bulletin, the Climate Investigation Center filed a formal complaint, raising concern that he hadn't disclosed these funding sources despite the paper declaring no conflict of interest. To be fair to Soon, disclosure standards in scientific publishing have historically been inconsistent. The same reporting that covered his case also noted other researchers in unrelated fields who faced similar disclosure questions without the same level of public attention. That context matters. But the scale and consistency of his funding, almost entirely from fossil fuel-linked sources over nearly a decade, is what made his case a focal point in this broader debate about industry influence on climate research. So that's the funding side, fully documented. Now here's the part most one-sided videos on this topic skip entirely. What does the mainstream scientific community actually say about the research itself, separate from the funding question? The Smithsonian Institution itself has publicly distanced its research organization from its conclusions, stating that his opinions on climate change are his personal views, not shared within the organization. A former director of the Center for Astrophysics, Erwin Shapiro, went further, saying that within the institution, essentially no one paid attention to his conclusions. On the science itself, NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies climate scientist Gavin Schmidt has publicly challenged Soon's methodology on multiple occasions, arguing that his statistical approach doesn't hold up against the broader body of climate data. This isn't new. Back in 2003, Soon and a co-author published a paper in the journal Climate Research arguing that the 20th century was uniquely warm compared to the last 1,000 years. 13 scientists published a formal rebuttal shortly after, raising 3 specific objections: that the data used reflected moisture changes rather than direct temperature, that it failed to properly distinguish regional from global trends, and that the historical proxy data used wasn't precise enough to support the paper's conclusions. The dispute became serious enough that several members of the journal's editorial board resigned in protest, saying the peer review process had failed. So here's where we land. There's a real physical basis behind why solar activity matters for climate. Nobody credible disputes that the sun is a major factor in Earth's climate system generally. The genuine scientific disagreement is about magnitude, how much of the last 150 years of warming solar variability can actually explain, versus other factors including greenhouse gases. On that specific question, the majority of published climate research finds solar variability alone doesn't account for the trend, while Soon's research argues it accounts for considerably more than mainstream models allow. So, let's go back to where we started. 99.99% of our climate's energy comes from the sun. That part isn't in dispute. The real disagreement is whether the variability in that energy, the small fluctuations Soon has spent his career studying, is powerful enough to explain the climate changes we've measured over the last century and a half, or whether other factors, including rising CO2, played a larger role that most published climate science currently supports. Soon's papers keep getting published. His critics keep publishing rebuttals. Both things are true at the same time, and that's what makes this a genuinely active scientific debate, not a settled question in either direction, no matter which side of it you find more convincing. So here's the honest question. After seeing both the evidence and the criticism, does the sun-driven explanation hold up for you? Or does the mainstream consensus make more sense based on what we just covered? Drop your take in the comments. I read everyone on videos like this. If you want to see the funding controversy covered in full detail, including the documents themselves, that's coming in a follow-up video. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.